We're getting settled in here.
Nobody's on the chat yet.
All right, let me just go ahead and invite you to bow your heads, and we'll start with prayer. Father, we want to thank you for, again, being wonderful Heavenly Father, watching over us throughout yet another week, bringing us here safely this morning. We're thankful for all those who are joining us online as well, or who can catch the study at some other point. Lord, we're living in very tumultuous times. We know that everything that can be turned out, of course, will be in the near future. We're just asking that you help prepare us for those events, fortify not only our lives, but our hearts and minds as well. May we be completely in tune with your Spirit, and we're praying that you'll guide and direct us every step of the way. We're asking, Lord, that you would be with perhaps Ken or others who may be on the way, and that you would guide and direct in our time together. And we ask these mercies in Jesus' wonderful name. In Christ's name. Amen and amen. Okay, well,
Kenny's here.
Ken's here?
That's what she was barking at.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Go ahead.
Strangers
Prop
approaching.
that door open there a little bit for him. So
He's still in his car.
okay. Cool.
Let's give him another minute so he doesn't have to miss any of the story.
Yeah,
He
and
hates to miss the story.
yeah.
She was like, I was just looking at
But you see, that for back then, 1833, whatever it was, back then was for those people. It had nothing to do with us.
Sure.
But today, we'll have our own signs.
Well, I don't know if you realize it or not, but this August,
Oh, he's got his glasses on today.
Yeah.
yeah, this August eclipse, a couple days. Of course, you know, most people know the track. It's going to track clear across the country. I don't know if it's next year or 2025, but within the next couple of years.
Would you like some tea, Kenny? You want some tea? Get you something.
No, I'm okay.
Then the next couple of years, there's going to be another solar eclipse, and the shadow's going to track from the other side across, and there's going to be where it intersects, all right. And where it intersects is the New Madrid,
Yeah.
right? And so there are people out there even now saying that, you know, this is kind of marking the spot. X marks the spot of where something phenomenal is going to happen. We'll talk about it later, but we don't want to get into it now. But
There's all kinds of people worried about how this eclipse is going to affect us.
there's all kinds of ways that we as a nation could be kind of humbled and brought to our knees. And there's no question that once we void the law of God legislatively, once our country speaks from its legislature, that God will remove his protective hand and things will happen. So anyway, we'll get to some of the time.
We're on to chapter 13 this week. This is back to Helene and the family at home. After months in Eskenrod, Helene and the children yearned for the privacy and comforts of their own home. Please, Moody, please let's go home, the children begged. We want to see our cousins and our friends. God can protect us there as well as here. Finally, Helene gave in. They quickly packed their belongings and piled them high onto 3 vehicles they possessed: a battered black bike, the baby buggy, and the stroller. Early in the morning they set out. This time they couldn't take the train because large portions of the tracks had been destroyed. They would have to cover the 40 miles on foot. Where are you heading? People asked along the way. Frankfurt. You'll never make it though, the people said. All the roads are blocked by tanks. Helene nodded politely, but she was thinking inside, even if 1,000 tanks are blocking the road, I'm going to get my children home. If the Lord is with us, nothing will happen to us. They covered the miles at a steady pace, up and down hill. The boys took turns riding the loaded bike. Lottie pushed the stroller, and Helene followed behind with the baby carriage. The going got harder as the day got hotter. Finally, they started up a long hill, and Lottie had no more strength. Helene called to the boys, and Gerd came running. Here, he said when he saw his sister's condition, give me that. He gripped the stroller's handles in both fists and with a mighty effort pushed it the rest of the way up the mountain, while Lottie clung to the buggy that Helene was pushing. At the top of the hill they rested. Helene pointed downward. Look, she said, way down there I see a house. If we can make it that far, we can get something to eat and drink and we'll feel better." So encouraged, the children struggled on. When they reached the house, a woman was leaning out the window, calmly watching their approach. Helene greeted her. "We are on our way to Frankfurt, and I have 4 children. Could you give us something to eat and drink? We would appreciate it very much." While they rested in the shade of an apple tree, the woman returned with nothing but a pitcher of water. "Now drink," she said, "and then go. I don't want strays hanging around my place." Helene was close to tears. They all took a long drink, and even baby Susie drank the water. Then they continued down the dusty road. As night came, they crawled into an empty hay barn and slept. Next morning they continued, hungry and tired, and soon they were exhausted. The sun burned from the sky, causing perspiration to run like water off their bodies. Helene, whose heart beat as if it were going to burst, had to fight for every breath. Lottie's face was swollen and bluish. Afraid of heat stroke, Helene laid her down by the side of the road in the shade of a wheat field and quietly talked to her, wiping her face with a handful of cool grass. "Don't be sad," she said. "We'll just go a little further and then we'll find another house. There'll be shade where we can rest. Be brave, Lottie. God will look after us. Let's continue just a little further." They got to their feet and labored on in the unbearable heat along what seemed like endless miles. What's the matter?
Just notice the cocoa back there,
Oh, yes.
snuggled up behind you.
She was begging during prayer. Finally, Lottie called, "Mutti, Mutti, I see a house." And as they approached, a woman came out. She took one look at them, and Helene cringed inside, waiting for another rebuff. But this woman was different. "You come with me inside the gate here," she said, taking hold of the baby buggy. "Rest in the shade while I get you something to eat." She returned with cool peppermint tea and then a hearty vegetable stew and thick slices of farm bread, which even tiny Susie managed to eat. Soon the family felt revived and continued on with renewed strength. That evening in the distance, they saw a water tower that wasn't far from their home. Helene knew there was an 8 o'clock curfew, after which no one was allowed on the streets. "We'll never make it in time," Helene thought. But on they went, and when the armed guards saw the bedraggled lot, they waved them through. "It's still standing," she marveled as they turned onto their street and saw the apartment building. Miraculously, it's still standing. The windows were blown out again, but no matter, they were home again. Home. "Moody," the children begged, "please let's stay here forever and never leave again." "I promise," Helene sighed. For her own sake as well as the children's, it was a promise she desperately hoped she could keep. But as fall came and then winter, she began to wonder if she would be able to keep it after all. Food was even scarcer than before. Now, in addition to listing the fallen soldiers, the newspapers printed the names of people who had died of starvation. Travel was restricted too. When they wanted to visit Papa's sister Annie and her 2 children who lived in downtown Frankfurt, they had to apply for a police pass, which was often denied. Yet they noticed the Nazi members could move about freely. And food, of course, was a top priority. Every night at midnight, Helene woke Kurt. Heavy with sleep, he stumbled out of bed and with stiff purple-blue fingers put on several layers of clothes, and finally his open-toed shoes. Like other children, he'd outgrown them and wouldn't be entitled to another pair until spring, so Helene had cut open the toes to give room for his growing feet. After gulping down a mug of hot ersatz coffee made of roasted grain, he stepped out of their temporary basement bedroom into the night. Turning his collar up and digging his hands deep into his pockets, he bowed his head against the biting wind and walked through the streets to take his place in the bread line. Other isolated figures, dark and lonely, straggled in from other parts of town. Eventually they reached their destination, the line in front of the bakery, sometimes 20 people long, sometimes 50, all cold and silent, waiting for their daily ration of bread. 2 hours later, a sleepy Gerd arrived to relieve his brother, and Kurt went back home, crawled into bed fully dressed, and hoped he would get warm enough to go back to sleep. Lottie would then relieve Gerd, and on lucky days the bread would arrive during her turn in line. If there was a delay, Kurt took another turn, and often when the bread bearer got home, the heel of the loaf was already eaten. But Helene didn't have the heart to scold the hungry children. But the stone-cold winter finally gave way to another spring, And as soon as she could, Helene planted spinach in a protected, sunny spot in their garden plot. It soon sprouted, and the children knew that it was reserved for the baby who badly needed some enrichment in her diet. One morning Lottie came home crying from her stint in the bread line. She sat down at the kitchen table, still dressed in a threadbare coat. Her wrists were chafed from the cold where her outgrown sleeves no longer covered them. What happened? Some of the big kids pushed me out of line, she sobbed. I had to go all the way to the back, and when I finally got to the bakery, the bread was all gone. And I'm so hungry. We still have a little rice, Helene said comfortingly. We'll be all right until tomorrow. Later, when she went to the garden patch to get some spinach for Susie, she found the little patch had been picked clean. In dismay, she returned home and demanded an explanation. Kurt confessed to having eaten the spinach. What could Helene do? They were all starving. One day they had unexpected company. Papa's sister, Tante Annie, and her husband, Uncle Fritz, were at the door. Uncle Fritz was home on furlough. He had been posted to Breslau, where he served in the flak artillery, and he told the family that the fighting there was terrible. I don't know if I'll make it, he concluded. They prayed together, and after a few days, he went back to his post. It was the last they saw of him. The German forces in Breslau were completely wiped out with no survivors. Uncle Fritz was listed as missing in action. Some time later, Tante Annie and the cousins, Anneliese and Herbert, again stood at the door. The previous night while they were in the bunker, their apartment in downtown Frankfurt had been bombed and completely destroyed. For a few days they stayed with the Hassels, and then they were evacuated to a small town on the Rhine River. Would this horror never end? Helene was assigned a 14-year-old girl to help her with housework. Hitler had decreed that upon leaving elementary school, all girls had to provide a year of free labor as their contribution to the war effort. Thekla was an illegitimate child, not wanted at home, and she was glad to be with Helene, who treated her with kindness. However, she had no idea how to take care of a baby and a household, so Helene patiently taught her the necessary tasks. Thekla became very attached to the family and visited them several times after the war. As before, the children went to church on Sabbath instead of attending school, making them unpopular with all their instructors. Gerd's math teacher, Herr Newman, especially took a dislike to his small pupil. "Hassel," he snapped, "you are defying me. You refuse to use the Hitler greeting and you stay away on Saturday, but I know how to get the best of you." Herr Newman arranged his lessons so that Saturday was the day on which he would introduce any new math concept. Then every Monday morning he pulled his red grade book out of his briefcase, opened it, glanced at the roster of names, and then called on Gerd to come to the board and work the new problems. The first 2 times, humiliated and frightened, Gerd stood helplessly at the board watching his teacher mark the failing grade, a big 6 in the red book, while his classmates snickered. Finally, he adopted the routine that Kurt and Lottie had been following all along. On Sunday, the 3 trudged to the houses of their fellow students and asked them what the teachers had covered the day before and what the homework for Monday was. Since few of his classmates were very interested in math, Gerd usually got 3 or 4 different versions. But back home, he took his math book and studied the problems on his own until he mastered the concept. The thoroughly unpleasant Herr Newman had it in for 2 other boys also, and missed no chance to shame them and mark them down in his hated red book. "Let's get revenge," they said. So the 3 of them waited for an opportunity. On the last day of school, they had their chance. Herr Newman left the grade book lying on his desk. 2 of the boys acted as lookouts, while the 3rd one crept into the classroom and snatched it. "What'll we do with it?" After a bit of debate, they decided on a ceremonial act of destruction. They divided the tasks and agreed to meet in half an hour on the banks of the river Nidda. There they set to work. First they flipped through the pages and double-checked the grades. They saw the long row of 6s by their names, while other students had scores of 1 and 2. "That does it," one said. "Is everything ready?" They placed the book in a battered tin bowl, doused it with some gasoline, and set it on the water. Standing back, they lit a match and tossed it into the bowl. As the book burst into flames, someone nudged the bowl with his foot, and they watched gleefully as the current carried the hated red grade book downstream. Herr Düring, meanwhile, had renewed his campaign of harassment. Soon Helene received another letter from the school, and even before she opened it, she knew what the visit would be about. She explained her situation to the new principal. "Frau Hassel," he responded, "you and your family are accused of being Jews in disguise. I order you to send your children to school on Saturday." Helene had been through this before and was firm. "My children will not come," she said, "and there is nothing you can do about it. God is able to take care of us." He slapped his open hand on the desktop. "We'll see about that," he hissed. Arriving home, Helene told her dismayed children the familiar news. "Oh, Mutti," Lottie wailed, "the children are already making fun of me, and they're so mean. Now it will get even worse." "Don't be afraid," Helene consoled her. "God has thousands of angels to keep us safe. He can do a miracle." So on Sabbath morning, the family knelt for prayer. Before they got off their knees, the air raid siren sounded. "Here come the bombers," said Lottie. Kurt's eyes opened wide. Why would they fly in the daytime when our flak can easily shoot them down? Then he added excitedly, "Mutti, that means there's no school. School's canceled during the raids." Remarkably, from then on to the end of the war, among the incessantly nightly air raids over Frankfurt, one happened every Sabbath morning. Tanti Kohler was a faithful Adventist member and one of Helene's friends. Her only son had spoken out against the government and had been arrested and deported to a concentration camp in Dachau. Contrary to policy, she had been given permission to visit him there once, and thus was one of the few people who knew about the atrocities committed in the death camps. She knew a little English, so at night she would secretly place her little radio under the bed covers and listen to the news on the enemy station, an offense that would have landed her in the death camp if she had been found out. The German news, of course, was full of propaganda to keep morale as high as possible. "More battles have been won," the papers shouted. "The Führer makes further advances in the east." Always, always, Germany was victorious. But London's BBC told a different story. When Tanti Kohler came to visit, she and Helene would whisper behind closed doors, and the truth was that the Allies were battering the Germans mercilessly, pushing them back on all fronts. "This can't last much longer," Helene prayed. "Dear God, help it stop, help it stop." And by now, even people who didn't listen to the BBC knew the tide was turning. All they had to do was look at the heavens. Every day, like silver birds high in the sky, enemy planes could be seen flying in formation to unknown destinations. Kurt and Gerd had once counted 1,100 planes in one squadron alone. That's a lot of Air Force.
It's a lot of counting.
It's true.
Boy, they could see good, they'd count that many.
At night, the same thing always happened. First came the reconnaissance planes flying high and scouting out the evening targets, then dropping burning flares that illuminated the area to daylight brightness while they slowly drifted down. Because the markers had a triangular shape, the Germans nicknamed them Christmas trees. Then the bombers rumbled over in squadrons of 20, releasing their death cargo at the same time, so the designated areas were carpeted with bombs. Whenever the evening air raid sirens went off, Helene ran outside to look toward the night sky. Often she saw the dazzling Christmas trees staking out her own complex of 6 apartment buildings, probably mistaking them for a German army camp that was located 20 miles away. Then she would start to pray, "Father, protect us this night. You are strong and powerful, and I know that your angels are surrounding these apartments. Keep us safe." And as she watched, one by one, the Christmas trees went out. By the time the bombers arrived, their target was no longer marked, and they dropped their loads randomly. Helene and the children huddled in the small basement room, unable to sleep in the inferno and tired to exhaustion. For hours each night, they heard the bombs whistling and hissing as they approached the ground, followed by an earth-shattering explosion. If the hit was close by, the whole building shook and the floor rolled like an earthquake. The air pressure shattered the windows and tore open the doors. If someone hadn't made it to the basement in time, they were hurled down the stairs. Shrapnel sprayed through the air. These bombardments were endless. The constant danger, the lack of sleep, and cold tore at everyone's nerves. But throughout the entire war, not one bomb scored a direct hit on those 6 apartment buildings. After extra heavy attacks, Kurt and Gerd took the family's wooden hand cart and pulled it the 5 miles into the city center. They had to pick their way carefully through the rubble that littered the streets. Often there were charred bodies, shrunk to 1/3 of their normal size, the remains of people who had fled their houses during a raid and had been burned by phosphorus bombs. The buildings were still smoldering after raging fires, and carefully the boys pulled out beams, doors, window frames, anything else that could burn. Sometimes they found unexploded mines, which they laid aside and continued on their way. They didn't fully comprehend the danger of these devices until one of Kurt's schoolmates got his hand blown off when he handled a grenade. When their cart was loaded, they hauled their take-home for Helene to use for heating and cooking. A favorite pastime of the boys became searching the ground for pieces of unusually shaped shrapnel. These were highly prized among the children and could be used to barter for other treasures. Herr Düring continued to plot Helene's downfall. He hatched up a new scheme. Kurt, now 14, was ordered to join Hitler's organization for young people, the Hitler Youth. These young people learned survival skills, went to social functions, and spent many hours each week performing civic duties, like sweeping streets, I just lost the page again, collecting garbage and helping in hospitals. Maybe this is a way my son can participate without violating his principles, Helene thought. It sounds harmless and benevolent. Why antagonize the Nazis when we don't have to? Kurt obeyed the summons and went to the enlistment office. After he'd filled out the paperwork, he was issued the regulation Hitler Youth uniform, tan trousers and a brown 4-button shirt with a turned-down collar and 2 patch breast pockets, a brown cloth peaked cap and a black neckerchief gathered at the throat, with a brown leather ring and a black leather belt, its shiny buckle imprinted with the German eagle clutching the swastika, encircled by the bold legend, Blood and Honor. As he listened to the chatter swirling around him, however, Kurt began to wonder how harmless this venture was going to be. Strutting proudly in their uniforms, the other young people bragged about future power positions and how the Hitler Youth was the sure route to make it into the esteemed ranks of the SS, Hitler's elite forces. Maybe this wasn't a suitable organization for a young Christian at all. Immediately, Kurt was assigned to Sabbath duty, and quietly he made the decision to stay home. There were so many kids, he thought maybe they wouldn't notice his absence, but he was mistaken. The Hitler Youth leader, himself an immature youth of 17, came to the Hassel apartment early one morning. "Frau Hassel," he said in an insolent tone when she opened the door. "Kurt plays hooky from civic duty on Saturdays. I am here to demand that he report this Saturday." Helene eyed him calmly. "You cannot tell me what to do," she said. "You're only a little older than Kurt yourself. I am his mother, and I'm the one who determines where he goes, not you." The young leader had evidently been watching his superiors, because he behaved exactly as they did. He stiffened. "I'll show you who is in charge here," he barked. "I'll report you to the party. Then we'll see who's boss." "You do what you have to do," and Helene closed the door on him. Next time he saw Kurt, the leader hissed, "I'd like to kick you so hard you can't walk anymore. You think you're so high and mighty? I'll fix you." The response from the party was immediate. Kurt received a hand-delivered letter. He was being drafted into the army for immediate posting to the front. He had to report that afternoon at 4 o'clock. When Helene read the notice, she had the impression someone was tapping her on the shoulder. When she spun around, no one was there. She thought she heard a voice whispering, "Hurry, hurry, why are you hesitating?" The voice increased in urgency. Suddenly, Helene knew what she had to do. "Kurt," she said, "get your bike and ride to Eskenrod. Here's a little piece of bread. Put it in your pocket." "Can't I take some more food in my backpack?" Helene shook her head. "You can't take anything along, otherwise the neighbors will know you are escaping." Kurt took a deep breath and shook his head in bewilderment at these rapid decisions. "What about you? They'll come for you." "I will follow with the children, Gerd." "Gerd, you're moody. Gerd, go outside and see if anyone is watching." When all was clear, Kurt set out and quickly disappeared from sight. Helene ran through the apartment, gathering up a few of the most necessary items. With these, she carefully patted the baby carriage. She couldn't take much. It must look as if they were just taking the baby on her customary afternoon walk. She put Susie in the buggy and gathered Gerd and Lottie around her. "Stay right here for a minute," she said, and stepped across the landing to a trusted neighbor's door. She knocked softly. The door opened a crack, then wider, and the woman pulled her inside. "I have come to say goodbye again," Helene began. "We are going to the country. I can't tell you where." The woman winked. "I understand. You just go in peace. If anyone asks me, I know of nothing. I'll keep an eye out for your husband." Gratefully, Helene shook her hand, and she and the children stepped outside. No one saw them leave. Later, Helene learned from her neighbor what had happened that afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the Hitler Youth leader accompanied Herr Düring and another party official to the apartment. They found only a closed door. They rang the bell, they knocked, and kicked the door. They looked into the windows and saw that nobody was there. "Just you wait," they shouted in frustration. "We'll get you. We'll come back and get you out of bed, you draft dodger. Then you will finally get what you deserve." They rang the neighbor's doorbell. "Is Frau Hassel home?" "I'm sorry," she said truthfully. "I don't know where she is. Have you tried ringing the bell?" "We'll be back tonight and get Kurt if we have to force the door." With a shrug, the woman went back inside. And at midnight they returned. They hammered the Hassel's door for a while, and again they rang the neighbor's bell. She was ready for them. "I have had enough of this," she screamed. "It's the middle of the night. Get out of here and leave me in peace." She slammed her door and double-locked it. The men banged on the doors of other apartments, but nobody opened. Enraged, they finally left. All this time, Helene and the children plodded along the familiar road. The miles stretched endlessly. Russian prisoners of war were trudging in the same direction, living skeletons, their bloody feet wrapped in rags. When Helene stopped to give the children a slice of bread, they watched with burning, hollow eyes. Helene took her own piece and gave half of it to one of the men. He greedily devoured it. And as they walked along, one of the Russians, a young man, looked into the buggy. When he saw Susie, he gently stroked her little cheek. Then for miles he walked beside the carriage, holding the baby's hand, with tears streaming down his emaciated face and falling in the dust of the road. Helene's heart went out to him. She wondered if he had a baby of his own at home. Dusty and starving, they arrived in Eskenrod 2 days later. The Yosts, never expecting to see them again, had taken other evacuees into their home. But Herr Straub, the mayor of the village, agreed to give them shelter, and as they fell into bed, they wondered what would await them there. That's the end of 13.
So they had to leave again?
Yeah, so the story shifted back to the family. I mean, obviously, he's still out there with his army unit, right? The husband. So it's just interesting to, this isn't just about a war story, but it's all the fallout of the war that people have to work through. And of course, one of the biggest issues is the availability of food. But it's also interesting to me that they would try to keep some kind of routine going. Like, the kids would go to school when there wasn't a bombing raid or something like that.
Because it was good for morale to have life as normal as possible.
Yeah. So, but it's also interesting that here you see, from our side, we would say, we don't think about God working to protect people on the other side. You know what I'm saying? You think, well, they're the enemy, so we just need, God's going to help us get rid of them. I mean, that's what we're thinking, right? God's going to help us get rid of the enemy. And they're thinking, God is going to protect us from the other, from the other side. So it's just interesting to watch all that play back and forth. We don't typically think of that, I think during the war, when you had these suicide bombers, they would actually pray before they would, drive their plane into a ship or something, thinking that they were doing an honorable thing, for the empire. So, very interesting. So we'll pick it up next week. Very good.
Trina's with us too. Good morning. Trina and Dan and Susan and Scott so far that have checked in.
Okay, so we're moving forward, Matthew chapter 26. We want to finish that today. So if you open your Bibles there.
Trina said she loved the story. It gives us hope.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think we can read about it, but to actually live through some of that, and we're only getting little snippets of what they had to deal with, maybe some of the highlights, but there's still 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, 30, 31 days in a month, etc., that just drags on and on and on. Our time will come, and of course the big problem in this society here is that we are so far removed from any of that discomfort, any of that type of circumstance. People aren't going to say, they're not going to be thinking, what do I need to do just to survive the next day, or this day and the next day. They're going to say, oh, my neighbor has something, I'm going to go get it. So it's a different mentality. Okay, but yeah, God will see us through, right?
And Scott was right. He said after this eclipse coming on Monday, the next one that'll be visible over North America will visit it April 8th of 2024.
2024. Okay. So that's what I was thinking. I wasn't quite sure of the date. And that's going to intersect over the New Madrid.
That's the next one, is not this one?
Well, this one's going to run through it, but then there's another one coming that's going to come down from the north down toward the south, and it's going to exit through, and where the X is the New Madrid.
What does that mean?
Well, some people are thinking that that's kind of X marking the spot of something horrific that'll take place. So we'll have to, who can say?
Some are thinking that they could trigger earthquakes if they were.
Right. All right, so we're on to chapter 26.
Frankly, I don't know how it could.
And Jesus has been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and taken by a mob, and they're going to run him off. Of course, it's at night, right? So they're going to run him off to face the Jewish leadership, the Sanhedrin, and the priests and so forth. All four of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all talk about this particular scenario. And it's just interesting if you have an opportunity to read each of their accounts. They each add a little different perspective, to what happened here. But let me read through them. I'm going to read through Matthew, and I think maybe I'll read through John too, and just so you can see a little bit of the difference. And then we'll go back and talk about it. Truly, one of the most fascinating things was this circumstance here that occurred in the life of Jesus. All right. So I'm picking it up in verse 57 in Matthew 26. And those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Now, does anybody know who actually he went to first? Where did they take him first? Matthew says here they led him off to Caiaphas, the high priest.
He was the governor.
He was the high priest. But they took him someplace else.
So they led him away to Caiaphas, where the scribes and elders were assembled.
Right.
So was it out of his house or in his courtyard or something?
Right. Okay. But we'll get to when we go to John. You'll see. All right. But Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. This had always been their plan, right? They'd been scheming for years to kind of bring this about. But they found none. They found no false testimony. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus did what?
Covered his face.
He kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is as you say. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered and said, "He is deserving of death." Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is the one who struck you?" So from there, we go into verse 69 to the end here, talking about the focus now shifts to Peter. Right? Peter sat outside the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him, saying, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you're saying." And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth." But again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." And a little later, those who stood by came up and said to Peter, "Surely you also are one of them, for your speech betrays you." Then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So he went out and wept bitterly. When you look at some of the other accounts, Mark 14, Luke 22, John 18, they actually put that aspect of the story in front of, they kind of reverse the order a little bit there. In John, John has it the same order, but I think Luke, one of them that I read, had it reversed. I'm going to take you over now to John chapter 18. And let's see. In verse 12, John 18, verse 12. It says, "Then the detachment of troops and the captain of the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year." So the first place that Jesus actually goes to is to the ex-high priest, Annas. That's where he goes first. Okay? And he was actually the more brilliant, if that's the right word. He was the more
The shrewd one.
shrewd, cunning. He was kind of he was an ex-high priest. Kind of a lot of people just really considered him to be the high priest, even though Caiaphas was in quote the office. Many people.
Remember now, the Romans appointed him as the high priest,
Right.
and took the other one out of place.
Right, but many of the Jews still considered him.
Looked at him
Still considered him
because they didn't honor what the Romans had done.
Right. So he goes to Annas first, and he's the father-in-law. Right. So he's much older. You know, he's the kind of the senior. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And of course, then John goes into verse 15 on down, goes into Peter's denial, and then it goes back to verse 19 where he's questioned by the high priest. And the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And this is Annas. Annas is the one who was really dialoguing with him, trying to get him to incriminate himself. And if you read through some of what took place out of the book Desire of Ages, chapter 74, I think it is. '75. Let me just share a couple paragraphs here, and then we'll go back and talk about this a little bit more. This is out of chapter 75. It says, Annas was the head of the officiating priestly family, because he was the elder. And in deference to his age, he was recognized by the people as high priest. His counsel was sought and carried out as the voice of God. He must first see Jesus a captive to priestly power. He must be present at the examination of the prisoner for fear that the less experienced Caiaphas might fail in securing the object for which they were working. So they're bringing in the experience, right? Supposedly. His artifice, cunning, and subtlety must be used on this occasion, for at all events, Christ's condemnation must be secured. Christ was to be tried formally before the Sanhedrin, but before Annas, he was subjected to a preliminary trial. Now, what you have to understand is that everything that's happening with this whole scheme is completely illegal, completely against the law. Okay? And we'll go into some of those particulars in just a little bit. And along the way, what we find in the scriptural narrative is Jesus is alluding to this at various times. Because he actually sat in dialogue with Annas a little bit. It says, under the Roman rule, the Sanhedrin could not execute the sentence of death. They could only examine a prisoner, pass judgment, to be ratified by the Roman authorities. So basically they were going to try to bring the case to the Romans that this prisoner was deserving of death. They had to build their case around that whole thing. It was therefore necessary to bring against Christ charges that would be regarded as criminal by the Romans. Okay? An accusation must also be found which would condemn him in the eyes of the Jews. So the reason why this was tedious is because they were dealing with two different nationalities. They were dealing with the Romans, who were in control, but they also had to make him look like a heretic in the eyes of the Jews. Okay? Because they feared that the people would rise up and save him. So they had to really be careful to make their case here. Not a few among the priests and rulers had been convinced by Christ's teaching, and only fear of excommunication prevented them from confessing him. So there were people in the Sanhedrin who believed in him, and some of those people are mentioned in Scripture, right? Who are two that may come to mind right away?
Nicodemus, yeah.
And
Joseph of Arimathea, okay, were two. But there were others as well. And so you got the leadership, the people that are in control. They're having to manipulate and play their own people, as well as try to concoct some criminal charges so that the Romans will go along with it as well. Okay? So this is the scheme that they're trying to work through. It says here, the priest well remembered the question of Nicodemus, doth our law judge any man before it hear him? And what doth he doeth? Or what? In other words, how can we convict somebody when we haven't actually heard what they had to say? So, this kind of thing. So this question had for the time broken up the council and thwarted their plans. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus were not now to be summoned. So they were going to leave these guys on the sidelines, and this is one of the primary reasons why they ended up doing this at nighttime. which was also illegal. Okay. The trial must be so conducted as to unite the members of the Sanhedrin against Christ. There were two charges which the priest desired to maintain. If Jesus could be proved a blasphemer, he would be condemned by the Jews. If convicted of sedition, it would secure his condemnation by the Romans. So they're dealing with these two particular things. Okay? We've got to make him look bad in the eyes of the Jews. The way to do that is to make him look like a blasphemer. What's a blasphemer?
A liar?
Claiming to be God.
Well, a liar, yes, but somebody, mere mortal man claiming
To be
be
the
God.
Son of
Yeah.
God.
to be prerogative of God. Take
They
the
wouldn't
prerogative.
let him, they didn't like him, tell him that he was the Son of God.
Right. Okay.
That there is blasphemy.
All right. The second charge, Annas first tried to establish. He questioned Jesus concerning his disciples and his doctrines, hoping the prisoner would say something that would give him material upon which to work. He thought to draw out some statement to prove that he was seeking to establish a secret society. So, again, trying to put words in his mouth, trying to question every little action, every little thing that he was trying to do. And of course, Jesus read him like an open book. Right? Jesus knew exactly what he was trying to do and reassured him, hey, look, everything that I've been out there saying, it's been done publicly. I'm completely transparent. I don't have any hidden agenda, right? And, everybody that's been out there has heard what I've had to say as he went about ministering to folks. So, it says here, as if reading the inmost soul of his questioner, he denied that there was between him and his followers any secret bond of union, or that he gathered them secretly in the darkness to conceal his designs, etc. There were no secrets in regards to his purpose or doctrine. Spake openly to the world. I spake openly to the world, he answered. I even taught in the synagogues and in the temple. And, so it was all completely laid out there. No sedition, not trying to overthrow the Romans or start a new kingdom or anything. So the Savior, now this is interesting, he contrasted his own manner of work with the methods of his accusers. So not only does he say, I've been completely transparent and open, he says, however, you guys have been running around, having these little meetings, secret meetings and whatnot, trying to find ways to trick me and manipulate, me and try to find false accusers. You're the guys that have been playing in the dark and with the darkness kind of thing. So, so it's interesting how Jesus is, trying to really bring their prejudice to the surface. The midnight seizure by a mob, the mockery and false abuse before Jesus is even condemned or even accused, was the manner of their work, not his. Their action was in violation of their own law. In other words, they just completely set aside all the jurisprudent structure of Jewish law to do what they did. Their own rules declared that every man should be treated as innocent until proven guilty.
Same way it is now.
Where have we heard that, right? By their own rules, the priests stood condemned. So, when this country was established, that was one of the foundational principles that was included in our Declaration of Independence, right? That you are considered and treated as innocent until proven guilty, right?
It's the other way around in the Army. In the Army, you're guilty until you are proven innocent.
Right. One of the reasons why there was such an influx of people coming to our country hundreds of years ago, and of course many of them were convicted, people that were accused of different things, and they were looked upon as being guilty before they were proven guilty. Okay? And so they said there's got to be, and of course they were under the Jesuit system of law, which basically says, the Pope is infallible, and if the Pope says you're wrong, you're wrong. Doesn't matter what evidence you have. So we're not even concerned about your evidence that justifies or proves your innocence. The Pope has declared you to be wrong. End of story. And so people said, we don't want to live with that. We want to reverse. That's one of the reasons why it was reversed in our Constitution, that you're considered innocent. Is that really the way things have developed in our society? Actually, we've kind of gone back to this idea that if you're accused of something, you're guilty, and you have to prove your innocence. And sometimes that can be very costly. So we have flipped it back around, which was established in our own Constitution. But the Jews also had that aspect in their jurisprudence system as well. Okay? And we'll talk about some other things too. I mean, they didn't even there was no prosecuting attorney in the Jewish jurisprudence system. There was no lawyer. There was no one standing up trying to prosecute you. Okay, and we'll talk about that, the reason for that in just a little bit here. So Jesus dialogues with Annas, and he's trying to trick him, manipulate him, right? Trying to remember we're talking about two different things here. They're trying to make him admit that he is going to set up a separate kingdom. He's involved in sedition, trying to overthrow the Romans, kind of thing. And that was something that had been happening, for decades. For decades, somebody would pop up, claim to be a Messiah, and the Romans would get wind of it, and they would arrest the guy and usually put him in prison. Right? Who was the most famous guy that was in that circumstance and was released from prison?
I know who you're talking about. Just
You just said, huh?
Who? Wait.
no.
Barabbas.
Barabbas.
Okay, Barabbas. Remember, Barabbas was released, and Jesus should have been released, but
Took Jesus.
he was a self-proclaimed Messiah and a real rascal, and he was released. Okay, so Jesus and Annas here, this real experienced rabbi, very seasoned rabbi, are dialoguing. Jesus starts to ask him questions. Now, of course, this is something that we don't find in the scriptural narrative. This is the behind-the-scenes stuff that is being brought out in Desire of Ages. Jesus asked the question, "Why askest thou me? Had not the priests and the rulers sent spies to watch his movements and report his every word? Had not these been present at every gathering of the people and carried to the priests information of all his sayings and doings? Ask them which heard me." This is Jesus telling him, Go ask the people, go ask the spies that you sent every day to kind of keep up with me. Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them, replied Jesus. Behold, they know what I said. So Annas is kind of silenced by the decision of the answer, fearing that Christ would say something regarding his course of action that he would prefer to be kept covered up. He said nothing more to him at the time. So now Annas starts to feel very threatened because Christ has basically told him, "I know exactly what you were doing. I know the game that you were playing." And now Annas doesn't want that information to be exposed, right? And so he pretty much shuts up. And then one of the officers, we read in Matthew's account there, where some of the officials ended up beating him. One of his officers, filled with wrath, as he saw Annas silent, struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Answerest thou the high priest so?" That's actually part of what we read there in John, I believe. So here you have this person that's been arrested falsely. They haven't been really accused of any crime yet, and they haven't been officially condemned, and they're taking this abuse now also. All of this was totally illegal in their own jurisprudence system. Okay, none of that was supposed to be happening, right? So, Jesus is pointing some of these things out, but there are other things as well, and we'll come back to some of this in just a minute here. But I just wanted to highlight some of the things that Jesus was alluding to in his response, and also show you clearly that this is the greatest injustice ever perpetrated on a human being. There are a lot of people that are falsely accused, right? We know that. Even in our own society today, probably some of us know people that have been falsely accused, people that were arrested for different things, people that have been put in prison under false testimony and erroneously treated, etc., etc. But this case here, when lawyers have sat down and looked at this case here, this is the extreme. This is the extreme injustice. Okay, and I guess one of the problems that the disciples had is that they also understood how it should have worked, and they got to behold firsthand all of the injustice. And their big question was what? Why is Jesus allowing this to happen to himself when he could easily, he could just prevent it, right?
Oh, yeah.
What did he tell them in the garden there? Hey, look, I could
Have 12
I could call 12 legions of angels down here, and we wouldn't have a problem, You'd only need really one angel. But at any rate, he's allowing this. And see, that's what's creating the big question mark in their minds. Why is he allowing this to happen? Right? And see, they still have not realized the mission and the plan. That's not sunk in yet.
I don't think they permitted all his apostles to go in to the court with him, did they?
No, they all in. Except for John and Peter.
John and Peter were allowed in. Okay. Jesus asked the question when they in the Garden of Gethsemane. How is it that you've come for me now? This is the first illegal thing that they did. They came to arrest him at night, and that was against their law for them to do that kind of thing. Particularly when they had no reason to arrest him. There was no legitimate reason to arrest him, and so but they come and they do it at night, right? Illegal.
Especially when he's always in the church,
Here's another thing: the use of a traitor, and thus an accomplice, in effecting an arrest or securing a conviction was forbidden by Hebrew law. Now, what I'm doing, I went online. I found a whole list of issues that lawyers have looked at and said this was against Jewish law. This was against Jewish law. This was illegal. That shouldn't have happened. It's absolutely incredible. So, when we talk about the use of a traitor or an accomplice, what is illegal about that? What's illegal? What was illegal in the Jewish law here that should have prevented them to respond with a traitor or an accomplice?
Said you had to be at least 2 witnesses.
Okay, out of the mouth of 2 witnesses.
2
Okay.
or 3.
And not only that, but what was the motivation of Judas?
Money.
Okay, it ultimately became money. He was paid
But
for it.
he
thought
thought he was forcing Christ's hand,
Right.
to be,
and then he was made king.
He would benefit
then
from
he'd
that.
be second in command or something like
Okay,
that.
so the reason why this was against the law was because you had another person's motivation or another person's agenda actually at play, and they could cause an innocent person to suffer because of their own greed and ambition. All right, so this was considered forbidden and illegal. So it says the use of a traitor and thus an accomplice in effecting an arrest or securing a conviction was forbidden by Hebrew law. Turning state's evidence was illegal in Hebrew jurisprudence. So again, your own testimony, unless it was backed up by other witnesses, was not allowed. Simply
Just
not allowed.
one's accusing.
Wasn't allowed. Okay. Now this is actually this is recorded in Leviticus 19:16 to 18 is where some of that information comes from. The arrest was not the result of a legal summons. In other words, they didn't have any reason to go and arrest him in the garden. Okay. In fact, we talked about it, I think, maybe a couple weeks ago. One of the reasons that they did this at night was because there wouldn't be a lot of other people. There wouldn't be a lot. I mean, people would be sleeping, right?
Keep other people from knowing it.
Yeah, because they feared. In fact, there were many times when they wanted to arrest him because of things he was teaching and whatnot. But because the people were there being
They were
blessed,
Afraid of.
they were afraid they would cause an insurrection. Okay, according to Hebrew law, it was illegal to bind an uncondemned man. One of the things, of course, what did they do? They had to, when they arrested him in the garden,
Yeah,
they bound his hands.
bound his hands.
Okay? And even after his hands were bound, what happened? Where he just released them. What happened after they bound his hands? What
Peter cut
Cut his ear off.
Right, Peter
serpent off.
sliced off the servant of the high priest's ear,
Uh-huh.
and Jesus just went like that and went up there and healed. Okay. So, but then they, of course, they bound them again.
That ought to have told them something right there. I don't know how. Somehow, boy, it's hard to convince somebody. Some people.
Right. Well, again, what that says to the disciples that are there, how easily Jesus could just walk away from this.
Mhm.
Right? They could not. He had been trying to prepare them for this moment when he knew he was going to allow them to take him.
They knew he was the Messiah, but yet they still wasn't picking up on the situation that was about to happen.
They didn't recognize that in playing the role, the human role of substitute, he had to be the lamb led to the slaughter. Okay, he had told them,
He
"I'm
told
going to be
them that.
crucified." They're like, it's got to be a metaphor, or something. They weren't ready for this. So they have an illegal hearing. They go to Annas first, and then Caiaphas, and they lived. I believe that they actually lived. There was just a courtyard between them, so they shared kind of a communal situation there. So they could go to one, and they could come back to the other, and then they could meet with the Sanhedrin also, Council 70.
But all 70 wasn't there. Nicodemus and them wasn't there.
Right, they didn't even notify people that they knew.
Would be against them, they didn't notify.
Right, they wouldn't even notify. Okay. It was illegal to proceed at nighttime, right? No one judge courts were allowed. So in other words, the reason for a committee, a group, the Sanhedrin, should have been, actually I think they eventually had 71, but in other words, not one person could like what they did with Annas and what they did with Caiaphas. It had to be a group.
Not only that, but even if they'd had all 70 of them there, and then all 70 of them found him guilty, they'd have had to let him go.
That's right.
Because they said that there's no way that he could have been.
The 70 people can agree, right,
Oh.
on one particular thing. Yeah, we'll talk about that for a little bit in just a second here. No private or secret interrogation could occur. No physical abuse was allowed. I mean, these are all stipulations within their own jurisprudence system that were totally ignored.
Every time they beat him with a whip and then smack him in the face and
Yeah, I'm going to read you
else.
some of the account out of here. And then when they went before the Sanhedrin, there were numerous violations of Hebrew law. They were actually supposed to have 2 sessions, right? When it came to a capital consideration, in other words, something that could end with a death penalty, they had to have 2 meetings, 2 sessions of the Sanhedrin, and they had to be a day apart. Okay. Now, why couldn't they allow that to take place? Anybody know?
If we had time, they would have lost their momentum.
When was Jesus arrested?
Well,
Thursday night.
if they'd have done it 2 different days, you know, but more of the people would know about it.
Okay. What's going to happen? What's going to happen the day following? What's going to be the day following? The day following is going to be Nisan 14, right? That is Passover, right?
Oh,
Okay. The court could not. It was against Jewish law for them to conduct any business
On a holiday.
during the
on
Passover.
the Sabbath, right? On the Sabbath, or on a feast day. And it was also against their law to perform any functions on the preparation of either the Sabbath or a feast day. So you see, when they pulled off this little maneuver in the garden, they knew that it would be against their law to conduct, in other words, to space this out over 2 days. They couldn't do it because that next day would have been the preparation day, right? So they couldn't do it.
So they wanted to get it
So they
over
had
with real quick.
Right, so they had to, ram it through, and they had to forget about this 2-session thing against the law, against their own law. No court sessions could even be held before the regular morning time. In other words, nothing could be held at night, which is what they were doing. They were doing it all at nighttime. Okay. I mentioned here, court was not held on the preparation day or the day before a festival or the Sabbath. It was illegal to condemn based on contradictory or false testimony. So if they were getting different testimony from supposed witnesses, right,
That's getting
then there was you couldn't condemn a person unless you had at least 2 that were in harmony. Okay.
I agree.
And as Larry mentioned there, it says here that if you had conflicting testimony, the accused was immediately set free. Right? And this is all stuff that was built into their jurisprudence system.
They had
They'll-
a
they'll-
good system.
Okay? Hearsay testimony. What's hearsay testimony?
He said that he said it.
Yeah, Kenny's not there, but I say, Kenny said this.
Yeah.
And Kenny's not there to back it up or, right? That's hearsay, right?
That's
Something that you
hearsay.
heard somebody else say, right?
Well,
that
every
was,
time it passes, somebody adds to it.
yeah, right. Hearsay evidence was not even allowed, but yet that's what they were dealing with here. Must have 2 credible witnesses. Hebrew law provided no lawyers either to defend or to prosecute the witness. Isn't that interesting? They didn't have a bunch of attorneys. They didn't have a prosecuting attorney, and they didn't have defense attorneys. Now, why? What do you think might be the reason for that? Rose, you probably know this.
I do know the answer, but I'm not going to give it away.
Well, they did not want him defended, I guess.
No, this was just in their jurisprudence system. This was their legal.
We'll have to watch
Structure.
that video this afternoon.
They had lawyers then.
Yeah, they had lawyers, but not for that.
They had priests. They had rabbis. The Sadducees were kind of like the Supreme Court. They were kind of the lawyers, what we'd call like a lawyer of the law. but they weren't prosecuting lawyers. And there were no prosecuting or defense attorneys in the Jewish jurisprudence system. Okay? And there's a reason for that. What do you think the reason is? Why wouldn't there be any defense attorneys? Rose, do you know?
I did.
Tell me.
Because the Jewish system was set up in such a way that it was designed to redeem the offender, not punish them.
Right.
And therefore, the lawyers in the Jewish system had to do all they could to keep from convicting the guilty person.
Right.
Their job was to find any loophole they could to keep them from being found guilty.
Right. And so actually, they weren't even called lawyers, but they were called judges. Okay. So the judge was really your defense attorney. Okay.
Well, usually, how many judges do they have anyway? They
70
had
at
more than
least.
one.
70.
70.
70. There were 70 judges. That was the Sanhedrin. And their sole responsibility was to defend the accused. Right? Now, what we see happening here is something totally different, right?
Yeah.
What we see happening in this trial is something totally different. Their mandate, right, their job description, if you will, was to, in some way, somehow, find a way to defend and to release the accused. Okay? Now, who was the prosecuting attorney? They didn't have one, technically, but who was the prosecuting attorney?
The high priest.
No. Well, that would happen in Jesus' trial, but in their normal functioning system, who were the prosecuting attorneys? They were the witnesses that would come with an accusation against you. So witnesses come with an accusation against you. They're the ones that are actually the prosecutors. They're the ones that are going to tell their story of how they were wrong,
Governor.
right? And then it was the responsibility of the judges to defend you. That's totally thrown out the window here, right? In the trial of Jesus, that is totally thrown out the window. First of all, they don't have any prosecuting witnesses with a reputable testimony, right? And then they have the judges who are actually trying to condemn him as well. So they have false testimony, false witnesses, and then the judges themselves have violated their own jurisprudence structure and system, and they become the ones trying to condemn you. I mean, absolutely incredible here, right? So in a capital case, the witnesses were also the executioners. That's interesting. In a capital case, the witnesses were not only the ones who were the prosecutors, but they were also the ones that would be the executors.
Well,
Right?
that-
In the jury system.
I didn't know. I thought it was against their law to put any man to death. I thought that's the reason they had to go have the Romans do it.
It was the witnesses. The Romans would allow it, right? But under their system, the witnesses were. If you were condemned to death and you were going to be stoned, it was the witnesses that had to stone you,
Had to stone.
right? They couldn't say to somebody else, because I mean we're dealing with an incredibly sensitive thing here, a very life or death thing here. And if you were going to go and testify against somebody, if you felt strongly enough that they deserved to die, you're the one that was going to do it. Okay. Under Hebrew law, nothing negative could be presented until at least one judge spoke in behalf of the accused.
That's why the
So,
Jews stoned Stephen. Yeah. They
Yeah.
were Jews. They weren't Romans.
exactly,
That beats.
exactly. But under their law, at least one judge had to promote, before any negative accusations could be made, one judge, at least one judge, had to speak positive, had to present the other side, the positive aspect. And what did they do? The reason they had this at night was because they didn't want any of the other judges saying, look at what this man has done. Look at how he has blessed thousands and thousands of people. I mean, there was nobody that they wanted in his corner that would speak up in his behalf. Okay? Right? But that was part of their law. They had to have that, according to their own law, they had to have that occur before anyone spoke, anyone accused him. Also, what was Annas trying to do when he was questioning Jesus to begin with? He was trying to get him to incriminate himself, right? He was trying to get him to say, well, well, maybe, it's about time we came up with a new system. It's about time we got rid of the Romans. It's about time, a new man came to town, a new head of something. They were trying to get him to self-incrimination was not allowed in the Jewish system. You couldn't even, by law, incriminate yourself. Right? You couldn't incriminate yourself according to the law. It was not allowed. And yet, they were trying to do it. They were trying to encourage him to do that. Right?
Now these same people were the ones that even went around and followed him too, to try to find him, try to catch something out of his mouth they could accuse him of.
Absolutely. I mean, this is such a demonstration that the violation of their own jurisprudence system and structure is so blatant here. Incredibly, it's just so blatant. It's astounding. And Jesus, of course, was well aware of all this violation, but he wasn't going to. Why wouldn't he, as a man that really had incredible intellect, why wouldn't he, as a man, wouldn't it be the natural thing for him to start pointing out all these violations, and say, you're a bunch of frauds. You're doing this, look what your law says over here, and you're doing this and this and that, all in violation. You are the lawbreakers. I'm the innocent person here. Why wouldn't he do that? I mean, he was alluding to some things.
He knows he has to make the sacrifice.
He knows he has to let this. He knows he has to let it go.
I think in a way Jesus probably enabled it a little bit because
by his silence, he's basically saying
he's giving him the fuel.
He's providing the fuel. Exactly. He knows that he has to become the substitute, so he has to let them continue on. A person could not be convicted on a unanimous vote from the judges. And that's what Larry was saying. If all of the judges, if there were all 70 there, and all 70 said guilty, the person automatically went free. Because in their law, they understood that 70 people could not agree on anything. You won't find 70 people that could come to the same conclusion on anything. They understood that, right? And so if all 70 came to that conclusion this person was guilty, they knew something else was at work to convince all those people, right? Another thing that they had to do in a trial like this is that under normal circumstances and in other circumstances, the older members could vote, and they also couldn't. I don't think they could do a secret ballot either. But in a capital case, which is what this was, right, a life or death issue, they had a procedure in place where the younger, they had to vote in a certain order. They had to vote from the younger to the oldest. So they had this in place where the younger members had to vote first, and then the older members voted last, and then the oldest guy voted last.
Why?
Okay, and why do you think that would be?
Because they didn't want the older ones to influence the younger.
They didn't want the older ones to influence the younger ones. Exactly. She said they had all of these checks and balances in their setup, and it was as if none of this had ever been in place, because they were violating all of this. All this stuff was in violation of what happened. One of the most incredible things that happened that we read about in Matthew's account there, and then if you read through the different accounts, what did the Caiaphas, what did he end up doing when Jesus was brought before him?
Ripped his garments.
He ended up renting his garments. Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and just read
Which
that.
was against the law.
That was against the law. Okay, he in fact, it was Caiaphas considered Jesus a kind of a rival. See if I can find it. I'll just pick it up from right here. Okay, so he's before Caiaphas, and it says, every ear was bent to listen, every eye was fixed on his face as Jesus answered. Caiaphas had asked him the question, right? And remember when he said to him, I adjure ye by the living God, tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Okay. Well, Jesus had been silent for most of these questions with Caiaphas.
That's the only question he answered, I think.
And yes, but this appeal he could not remain silent, and so there was a time to be silent. There was a time to speak. Had he not spoken, he had not spoken until directly questioned. He knew that to answer now would make his death certain. So he knew that this would kind of put the last nail in the coffin, so to speak. But the appeal was made by the highest acclaimed authority of the nation and in the name of the Most High. Christ would not fail to show proper respect for the law. So here he's going to show proper respect for the law that he knew. And he also knew that they were completely neglecting and violating one precept after the next. They had set the whole thing aside primarily because of their hatred. Christ would not fail to show proper respect for the law. More than this, his own relation to the Father was called into question. He must plainly declare his character and mission. Jesus had said to his disciples, whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess before my Father which is in heaven. So he's now going to confess by answering his Father in heaven. So by his own example, he repeated the lesson. Every ear was bent low to listen, every eye was fixed on his face as he answered, and he simply said, thou hast said. Thou hast said. A heavenly light seemed to illuminate his pale countenance as he added, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Whoa. Whoa, right?
Mm-hmm.
For a moment, the divinity of Christ flashed through his guise of humanity. The high priest quailed before the penetrating eyes of the Savior. That look seemed to read his hidden thoughts and burn into his heart. Never in afterlife did he forget that searching glance of the persecuted Son of God. He, forever, as long as he lived, he remembered that look. Okay?
You
Hereafter,
also remember that look in the resurrection too.
hereafter, said Jesus, shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. In these words, Christ presented the reverse of the scene then taking place. I'm sure he looked horrible. Beaten, swollen,
Beard pulled down.
bedraggled,
Bleeding and everything else.
right? He, the Lord of life and glory, would be seated at God's right hand. He would be the judge of all the earth. Here he was standing before them, supposedly the judges of Israel, but he would be the judge of the whole earth, and from his decision there could be no appeal. Then every secret thing would be set in the light of God's countenance, and judgment be passed upon every man according to his deeds. So basically he was saying to them, you think you're the judge, of Israel. I'm the judge of the entire world. The words of Christ startled the high priest. The thought that there was to be a resurrection of the dead. Now remember, Caiaphas he was a Sadducee. And very sad, you see, because they didn't believe in a resurrection. Right? So he's startled at that thought that there was to be a resurrection of the dead, when all would stand at the bar of God, really in front of him, the Messiah, to be rewarded according to their works. That was a thought of terror to Caiaphas. He did not wish to believe that in the future, he would receive a sentence according to his works. There rushed before his mind a panorama, the scene of the final judgment, and for a moment he saw the fearful spectacle of graves giving up their dead with the secrets he had hoped to that were forever hidden. For a moment he felt as if standing before the eternal judge, whose eye, which sees all things, was reading his soul and bringing to light mysteries supposed to be hidden with the dead. So it's like all of a sudden he's getting this vision almost of this panorama of things taking place that he believed were not possible and didn't want to have happen. The scene passed from the priest's vision. Christ's words cut him, the Sadducee, to the quick. Caiaphas had denied the doctrine of the resurrection, the judgment, and the future life. Now he was maddened by satanic fury. So, was this man a prisoner before him to assail his most cherished theories? Rending his robe that the people might see his pretended horror, he demanded that without further preliminaries the prisoner be condemned for blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses, he said. Behold, now we have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him, as we read. It says a high priest, according to the law, according to Hebrew law, was not to rend his garments. By the Levitical law, this was prohibited under sentence of death. I mean, he just pronounced death upon himself by doing this.
He really did.
Under no circumstance, on no occasion was the priest to rend his robe. It was, however, the custom among the Jews for the garments to be rent at the death of friends, but this custom the priests were not to observe. Express command had been given by Christ to Moses concerning this. When Moses was on the mount, getting the instruction for all the particulars on the sanctuary and the tabernacle, he was given specific instruction. Everything worn by the priest was to be kept whole and without blemish. By those beautiful official garments were represented the character of the great antitype, Jesus Christ. Nothing but perfection in dress and attitude, in word and spirit, could be acceptable to God. He is holy, and His glory and perfection must be represented by the earthly service. Nothing but perfection could be properly represent the sacredness of heavenly service. Finite man might rent his own heart by showing a contrite and humble spirit. This God would discern, but no rent must be made in the priestly robes, for this would mar the representation of heavenly things. The priest who dared to appear in holy office and engage in the service of the sanctuary with a rent robe was looked upon as having served himself or severed himself from God. By rending his garment, he cut himself off from being a representative character. He was no longer accepted by God as an officiating priest. So when you rent your garment, if you were in that position, you were just cutting yourself off from God.
He should have actually been executed.
Yeah. It says, this course of action, as exhibited by Caiaphas, showed human passion and human imperfection, which was not accepted. By rending his garment, Caiaphas has made of no effect the law of God to follow the tradition of men. A man-made law provided that in case of blasphemy, it says that a man-made law provided that in case of blasphemy, a priest might rend his garments in horror at the sin and be guiltless. Thus the law of God was made void by the laws of men. And so that's exactly what will play out at the end of time with the Sunday law as well, same kind of thing. Each action of the high priest was watched with intense interest by the people, and Caiaphas thought for effect to display his piety. But in this act, designed as an accusation against Christ, he was reviling the one of whom God had said, "My name is in him." Exodus 23:21. He himself was committing blasphemy. Standing under the condemnation of God, he pronounced sentence upon Christ as a blasphemer. So he was accusing Christ of being a blasphemer, but actually, by doing what he did, he declared himself to be a blasphemer deserving of death. Okay. And of course,
Which he will receive.
Which he will receive. It says, when Caiaphas rent his garment, his act was significant of the place that the Jewish nation as a nation as a whole would thereafter occupy toward God. And of course, he goes into talking more about how the whole nation themselves. This was kind of symbolic of the whole nation of Israel, kind of cutting themselves off. I would encourage you to read through this chapter. Let me just do two things in closing here. Also, when they got together in this courtyard, they were at Annas' place and then Caiaphas' place, and then they were at certain locations doing this preliminary trial thing. And then finally they took them to the Romans. We know how the story continues, where you had the Jews that had to get a conviction, and then they had the Romans who had to also convict him, and so forth. But they could only the sentence of, this was something I didn't realize, only the sentence of death could be pronounced in the hall of hewn stone. There was a certain place when they did capital case testimony or cases. Just like if you have a significant case in this country, you would go maybe to the Supreme Court. You know, you have these different places. You go to local court, then federal court maybe, and then ultimately to the Supreme Court. Well, they also had a place called the Hall of Gazith, or the Hall of Hewn Stone. And a sentence of death could only be pronounced as long as the Sanhedrin held its sessions in the appointed place. So not only did they have to go through certain jurisprudence procedures, but it also had to be at just the right location. They couldn't just do that anywhere. They couldn't just have a trial and pronounce a death sentence on somebody. Only at the Hall of Hewn Stone could that happen, and they weren't there. Another stipulation that they didn't follow. No friend or enemy could serve on the judicial bench. They had to recuse themselves. So if you had somebody that was an enemy, a known enemy, somebody that had spoken out against you, that person must recuse themselves from being even part of the process. And that, I mean, we're dealing with that kind of thing right now. You know, there are things that are happening in our own government right now, where people are friends of certain people or whatnot, and they are not recusing themselves. So, you know, we're even in our own scenario today, we're understanding the importance of this aspect right here. This they weren't following as well. Okay. Now I'm going to give you a statement here from a professor of law at Harvard University. This guy's name is Simon Greenleaf. Simon Greenleaf is a professor of law at Harvard University. Okay, and this is one of the statements that he made. He said, throughout the whole course of that trial, meaning the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the rules of the Jewish law of procedure were grossly violated, and the accused was deprived of rights belonging even to the meanest citizen, or the lowliest citizen. Jesus was arrested in the night, bound as a malefactor, beaten before his arraignment, struck in open court, physically, during the trial. He was tried on a feast day and before sunrise. He was compelled to incriminate himself, and this under an oath of solemn judicial adjournment. And he was sentenced on the same day of his conviction. In all these particulars, the law was wholly disregarded. So here's a law professor who's analyzed all these particular proceedings from Scripture, and basically has come to the conclusion they disregarded practically every aspect of their jurisprudence procedure.
Not only that, but sometime later, he was challenged to prove the existence of Christ, and he went through all documents, everything that was ever written about him, and he come to the conclusion that Christ Jesus was the Son of God, and that he was just as real as Aristotle and a bunch of them, but said that without shadow of a doubt, yes.
That was Greenleaf.
Yep.
The professor
Greenleaf
Robert
did it, yeah.
Greenleaf did that. That's amazing.
And quoted like 500 different things
Right.
that proved it.
I wanted to end with, I've got this highlighted here. It says, the sight of this pale, suffering face, those quivering lips that look of compassion and forgiveness, pierced his heart, like this is about Peter here, pierced his heart like an arrow. Conscience was aroused, memory was active. Peter called to mind his promise of a few short hours before that he would go with the Lord to prison and to death. How is it that Peter could just hours after making that bold statement that he would be there for Jesus?
He was scared.
He was scared.
He'd seen his master already arrested. He knew he'd be next in line.
And it ends. This paragraph ends with this: Peter had just declared that he knew not Jesus, but he now realized with bitter grief how well the Lord knew him, and how accurately he had read his heart, the falseness of which was unknown even to himself. And basically, when Peter had that moment of looking to Jesus, and he was so bitterly distraught, he left the place. And of course, he went back. He ended up in the Garden of Gethsemane again, but where it all started. And he recognized right at that moment that Jesus knew him better than he knew himself. And that's the case with all of us, isn't it? Jesus knows us better than we even know ourselves. Okay? And so how important it is for us to fall on the rock and to be broken. Because anybody in any particular circumstance is capable of anything. Isn't that true? We as human beings are capable of anything apart from the leading of the Holy Spirit and the conviction of the Holy Spirit. We're capable of anything. And that's why we have such nonsense out there today, and the crap that goes on out there. It's the reason for that. Unconverted hearts. Just being led of every whim. But it's important that we recognize that we need to follow in the path of the Lord. It says here, I'm just going to read these in conclusion here, the last few paragraphs. It says, and so by the third condemnation of the Jewish authorities, again, they're condemning him a couple times, Jesus was going to die. All that was now necessary, they thought, was for the Romans to ratify this condemnation and deliver him into their hands. Then came the third scene of abuse and mockery, worse even than that received from the ignorant rabble. In the very presence of the priests and rulers, and with their sanction, this took place. Every feeling of sympathy or humanity had gone out of their hearts. Now this is just the mob that is there listening to the scribes and the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin. If their arguments were weak and failed to silence his voice, they had other weapons, such as in all ages have been used to silence heretics: suffering, violence, and death. So the mob had been taken to a place, and this is why they called for his crucifixion, where all reason had left, and it was just if they believed he was a heretic, they just
Well, I
wanted
mean, this
him
is
gone.
also the mob. They're also all up at late hours of the night to go to a courtroom. I mean, most people who are up that late are usually up to no good as well.
When the condemnation of Jesus was pronounced by the judges, a satanic fury took possession of the people. The roar of voices was like that of wild beasts. The crowd made a rush toward Jesus, crying, "He is guilty, put him to death." Had it not been for the Roman soldiers that were there, Jesus would have not lived to be nailed to the cross of Calvary. He would have been torn in pieces before his judges had not Roman authorities interfered and by force of arms restrained the violence. I found that to be really interesting.
Yeah.
You know, that the judges had whipped up this mob, and of course Satan too, into such a frenzy that if the Roman soldiers hadn't restrained him. And so, you know, the point is, you see, I mean, heaven had written the script and how it was going to play out. And in Gethsemane, Jesus could have died. Right?
Satan wanted to get rid of
God
him. He didn't
strengthened
care
him.
how.
He could have died in Gethsemane. God strengthened him. Here in his trial, he could have been killed and torn apart. But what did the script demand?
It had
That
to
he
be
must be able to yield his life at the right time and the right place.
Right place.
Right time and
That's
place.
the only way he could apply the blood.
And even during his ministry, there were times where he was threatened and God just removed him. So, you know, we just have to remember that in all of this, it has to play out just the way heaven has written it. And when we come to prophecy and when we come to the book of Revelation here in a couple of weeks, we're gonna see that that everything that's been written, everything that's been prophesied, has to take place just that way. No man, no nation, no country, no organization is going to stand in the way of what God has put in place and has prophesied will happen.
Like Jesus said, the scriptures have to be fulfilled.
It'll be fulfilled to the letter. Okay, that will take us into chapter 27 next week, and please go ahead and take a look at that and review it. And Larry, could you close us in prayer? Okay. Coughing there. All right, so let's bow our heads and we'll close our time now. Father, we want to thank you and we want to praise you for your marvelous plan. It's when we review some of these additional insights of what you went through, we just has a profound impact. Should have a profound impact on every listener, every hearer, as we consider what you went through to play that role of substitute. Words are really inadequate, Lord, for a response. And so we just pray that our actions will be a testimony of what's in our hearts. We want to thank you for your marvelous plan, and we want you to use us, Lord, in lifting that plan up for others to behold, others to see and realize, that they might be drawn unto you. Fulfill that in our lives and prepare us for your soon return, we ask in Jesus' name. Also, we're praying that you would bless our fellowship and bless our meal, that we might continue to be fit vessels for your use. And be with all those who end up watching our studies together around the world, and as well continue to guide and direct in their lives as well. And we ask these things in the name of Jesus, our Lord and our Savior and Messiah. Amen and amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for your comments. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you can come back, and we'll be here next week, same time, same place, homechurch.us. We'll see you then. Have a great week.